All right, so today we're diving into something pretty important, giving these older neighborhoods a much-needed facelift, making them, especially those packed with apartment blocks, more livable for the future. And lucky for us, we've got this Sustainable Regeneration of Apartment Block Neighborhoods guidebook. It's got tons of European examples, which is right up your alley.
And none too soon, let me tell you. It's pretty mind-blowing, the sheer scale of what we're talking about. Did you know a whopping 75% of Europe's apartment blocks were built before 1990? Not at all. And that's precisely why this guidebook is so important. It really forces us to confront this reality. These neighborhoods, they're here to stay. We can't just, bulldoze history and start from scratch. Regeneration, not demolition. That's the sustainable way forward.
So it's like, what? We just keep sprawling outwards, building more and more suburbs. That can't be the answer.
You hit the nail on the head. That outward expansion, it seems tempting, but it comes with a whole Pandora's box of issues.
Yeah.
You've got the increased car dependence, those longer commutes, not to mention the strain on resources as we devour more and more land. It all adds up, you see.
To a bigger environmental impact.
Exactly. It's like a domino effect. These outdated neighborhoods, they become this catalyst, pushing people away, making those very problems even worse. And here's a real kicker the guidebook mentions. Even if every single new building from this point forward was perfectly zero emission by 2050, our cities would still be dominated by that old stock.
Wow, that's pretty sobering when you put it like that. It really drives home the point that we're not just building for the future, we're like stuck renovating the past, whether we like it or not. So where do we even begin? The guidebook talks about using these 6, what do they call them, lenses as a framework.
Right, 6 lenses, and they're a really effective way of tackling a problem this complex, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Those lenses are governance, economy, environment, resources, well-being, and equity.
Okay, so let's break those down a bit. Governance, we're talking about who gets to make the decisions, right? Who's calling the shots when it comes to these regeneration projects? It's not just like City Hall, right?
You got it. It has to be collaborative. Transparency is key, making sure residents, the people who actually live there, have a voice, not just the developers with the deepest pockets.
Makes sense. And what about the economy? It's got to go beyond just, making sure these projects are profitable for developers. What about the financial health of the whole neighborhood, the people who already live there?
Absolutely. It's about creating jobs locally, supporting those existing businesses, making regeneration benefit everyone, not just newcomers.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Environment, that seems, kind of self-explanatory. Greener neighborhoods, right? More trees, less concrete.
It's bigger than that. It has to be about resilience. How do we design for a future that's, frankly, unpredictable? Heat waves, potential flooding, you name it. It's about spaces that can withstand, maybe even mitigate those challenges.
So thinking long-term, not just quick fixes. Gotcha. Now, when we talk about resources, I'm assuming we're talking about, waste reduction.
Think of it as closing the loop, a circular economy in action. How can we reuse and repurpose building materials? Cut down on demolition waste, create systems where everything gets a second life, ideally.
So a whole different way of thinking about how we build and, unbuild these neighborhoods. Interesting. What about this well-being lens? Is that just a fancy way of saying, make it look pretty so people like it?
It goes deeper than just aesthetics. Imagine green spaces, those community gardens, streets that are actually designed for walking car. Where you're not dodging cars the whole time. Yeah. It's about mental and physical health. This holistic view of what makes a place livable.
And lastly, we've got equity. That feels especially important, especially when you think about all the different people who live in these neighborhoods. What does that look like in practice?
In a nutshell, making sure these regeneration benefits everyone who calls that neighborhood home. Doesn't matter how old you are, how much money you make, what your background is. We're talking accessible design, a diversity of housing options, and ensuring no one gets pushed out by gentrification.
Right. So it's not just about shiny new buildings. It's about, building a better society alongside them for everyone. I like that. But how do we actually put these lofty ideals into practice? Can you give us an example, maybe something from the guidebook?
Absolutely. Let's take that equity lens and, imagine a neighborhood going through a major revamp. Let's say you've got developers, right? And they come in with this grand vision all about attracting those, wealthier residents. Luxury flats, trendy cafes, the whole 9 yards. Right. Sounds good on paper, right?
Sure, but I can already see where this might be going. What about the folks who already call that neighborhood home? I'm talking about the families who've been there for generations, the older residents.
Exactly. Without that equity lens we talked about, you risk erasing the very soul of the place. Longtime residents get priced out, those mom and pop shops can't compete, and suddenly you've got this, I don't know, this hollowed out shell of what it once was.
So it's walking a tightrope, right? Revitalizing without erasing. Those six lenses suddenly feel even more crucial, kind of like guiding principles. But I'm curious, we've talked about the what of regeneration, but what about the how? These buildings, they need more than just like a fresh coat of paint, right? Didn't the guidebook mention something about a deep renovation?
It does, and that's where things get really interesting on a practical level, I think. Imagine it's like trying to take a car, say from the 1970s, and make it meet today's environmental standards. A new paint job isn't going to cut it.
Huh, you'd need to like rip out the engine and start over. So we're talking about going beyond basic insulation and really getting into the guts of these buildings.
Exactly. Out with those outdated heating systems, upgrading insulation to modern standards, maybe even integrating renewables right there in the building.
So like solar panels on the roof, maybe geothermal heating. That sounds ambitious, not to mention expensive.
It can be, yeah.
Yeah.
But the guidebook, it actually highlights a city, I can't recall which one off the top of my head. They managed to cut energy consumption in their apartment blocks, get ready for this, by 60% through deep renovation.
60%. Wow. That's like not just good for the planet, but that's got to be a huge chunk of change saved on energy bills for the residents.
Now you're talking. That's the thing. Sustainability, it
Yeah.
shouldn't be this abstract idea. It can have very real positive impacts on people's everyday lives.
Absolutely. And speaking of making these homes better, let's not forget the human side of things. I remember the guidebook mentioned universal design. What exactly does that entail? Are we talking like futuristic homes straight out of a movie?
Not quite flying cars, but the idea is really about inclusivity, making sure everyone can thrive in these spaces. Think about it. A neighborhood that's designed to be easy for someone in a wheelchair, it's also going to be easier for a parent pushing a stroller, someone recovering from an injury, even elderly residents with mobility issues.
So designing for those with the most needs, it actually benefits everyone. I kind of like that. It reminds me, were there any examples of this in the guidebook that really stood out?
There's this great program in Paris, actually, the Oasis Schoolyard Program. They've been transforming those concrete jungles, those typical schoolyards, into these little green oases. Trees, gardens, play areas, the whole works.
That sounds lovely, especially in a dense city center. But how does that tie back to this idea of universal design?
Well, on the surface, it's great for the kids, right? More green space, a chance to connect with nature, even in an urban environment.
Yeah, I mean, I would have loved that as a kid. Who wouldn't?
But here's where it gets really clever. Those trees and green spaces, they act like natural cooling agents. And that's especially important for older residents who are, as we know, more susceptible to heat waves. So it's like a win-win across generations.
Okay, now you're just making me wish our cities were designed this well. It's a good reminder that we can't just be laser focused on the buildings themselves. The guidebook seems to really advocate for expanding that view outward, right, to the spaces in between.
Precisely. It's about challenging that car-centric mindset that so many cities are stuck in. Looking at those streets, those public spaces, even how people get around as opportunities.
So less about demonizing cars and more about making life easier, more appealing even, for those who choose to walk, bike, take public transport.
You got it. The guidebook actually talks about creating what they call slow streets. So picture this, a street where pedestrians, bikes, public transit, they have priority. Traffic is calm, speed limits are lower, and suddenly the street becomes a place for people again.
I think I've seen a few of these slow streets popping up around where I live. It's funny, they've become kind of trendy, Cafes putting tables out, people feel safer letting their kids play. It really does change the whole vibe.
It's amazing how such a simple shift can make such a difference. And speaking of simple but effective, the guidebook had this great example from Barcelona, the super block concept.
Super block. That sounds intense, like some kind of massive block party or something.
Uh-huh. Not quite, although they do often end up feeling more social, I guess you could say. Basically, you take a group of blocks, right, and you severely limit car traffic within that area. So the interior streets, they become these little pedestrian havens, trees, benches, playgrounds, all that good stuff.
And people are on board with this. It seems like a pretty big change for anyone used to, hopping in their car to go everywhere.
Change is never easy, but the results, they speak for themselves. Reduced noise pollution, cleaner air, local businesses thrive because now there's foot traffic, and frankly, people are just more likely to interact with each other when they're not, stuck behind the wheel.
Okay, color me intrigued. Sign me up for a super block. But I have to say, all of this, from the slow streets to these super blocks, it feels very, I don't know, top down, like city planners coming in and making these changes. What about the people who actually live there? What role do they play in all of this?
Yeah, I get that. It's like we've been talking about these big, ambitious projects this whole time, deep renovation, slow streets, these super blocks. It's inspiring, sure, but it also feels, I don't know, kind of daunting, especially for, like, the average resident. You're absolutely right. It can't all be about these grand schemes.
Yeah.
The guidebook does a good job of highlighting the smaller scale stuff, those community-driven initiatives that are just as vital, in my opinion, for real, lasting change. It's about empowering people, giving them the tools to shape their own neighborhoods.
Right, because at the end of the day, sustainable living, it's not just about fancy tech or some urban design magic. It's about changing habits, right?
Yeah.
And no one's better equipped to lead that charge than the folks who actually live there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what kind of things are we talking about here?
Well, some cities have been supporting these maker spaces, basically community workshops where people can, learn to fix stuff, reuse materials instead of just tossing them. I love that idea.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that. I've seen these like repair cafes popping up all over the place. It's become kind of a thing. I even took my old toaster oven to one they had it up and running in like an hour. Beat buying a new one, that's for sure.
See, it's a perfect example of how sustainability can be practical, even, dare I say, enjoyable. And it's not just about individual actions either. I read about some cities experimenting with like gamified apps, to encourage sustainable living. You get points for conserving energy, choosing to bike instead of drive, that sort of thing.
A little friendly competition never hurts, right? And hey, if it gets people thinking about their impact, how those small changes add up, I'm all for it. But what about those bigger issues, like waste management, for example? That feels like a big one.
Oh, absolutely. The guidebook actually uses Copenhagen's waste management system as a prime example. They've made recycling so easy there, it's almost ridiculous. They've got these specialized bins for every kind of waste you can imagine.
So it's not just about wanting to recycle, it's about making it like brain dead simple to actually do it. Out of sight, out of mind, as they say. But all of this, the maker spaces, the apps, the super efficient recycling, it all hinges on the community being on board, right?
100%. The guidebook really emphasizes the importance of open communication, collaboration between residents and whoever's spearheading these projects. Residents need to be informed, engaged right from the get-go.
Because the last thing you want is for people to feel like these changes are being forced on them. Like, hey, this is what sustainable living looks like. Deal with it. It's got to be a two-way street, or should I say a slow street, where residents feel heard, empowered, like they have a real say in shaping their neighborhoods.
Now you're getting it.
Yeah.
That's what it's all about. Fostering that sense of shared ownership, because when people are invested in their communities, they're more likely to embrace those sustainable practices, advocate for positive change. It's a beautiful thing.
This has been fantastic, really eye-opening. We've covered so much ground, from the nitty-gritty of renovating those aging buildings to all the ways we can make these neighborhoods greener, more livable, more equitable. Lots to think about.
It's been a pleasure exploring all of this with you. It's a good reminder that creating these thriving, sustainable cities, it's not just a pipe dream. It's a challenge, for sure, but it's one we can tackle. And it starts with us reimagining what these neighborhoods can be.
Couldn't agree more. And for everyone listening, we'll leave you with this. As you've heard us chat about all these ideas from the guidebook, what really resonated with you, what possibilities, got those gears turning about your own community. Because ultimately, building a better, more sustainable future, it's a team effort. And every single one of us has a role to play in making that vision a reality.